Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of What the Forensics. My name is Nicole, and like always, I am joined here by the lovely Journey and Rebecca. On this episode, Journey is going to be telling us all about John Wayne Gacy and his horrible, horrible crimes and the terrible person he was. And Rebecca will then be educating us on a little bit about psychopathy, tell us what it is, and we'll link it back to John Wayne Gacy. I would also like to note that for this episode, there is a listener's discretion advised, as there are some detailed descriptions of abuse, sexual assault, and rape. With that introduction underway, do we want to shift it up a bit? And Journey, would you like to tell us a little bit about John Wayne Gacy?
Yeah, I didn't really know much about him before this episode, and now I'm kind of wishing I could go back to that. So I'm sorry and you're welcome for the trauma you are about to receive. So John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. His parents were John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. He had an older and a younger sister and no brothers. His father was an extremely abusive alcoholic, and he often physically abused him, his mom, and his sisters. And so as a result of this, John Wayne Gacy was very close with his mom and his sisters. And even though his father was a piece of shit, for a lack of a better term, young John Wayne Gacy really wanted to make his father proud, but he was rarely successful in making his father proud. Apparently, one of his earliest childhood memories was when his father beat him with a belt for messing up car engine parts that his father had put together. And he was only 4 at that time. And that leaves a lasting impression.
Whoa. Yeah. Okay. I watched the documentary and I don't remember the details, and so now
they didn't go into the details about his childhood as much as I thought they were going to.
Yeah.
So learning about his childhood kind of made me understand how he turned out the way he did.
Yeah.
And so then when he was 6 years old, he stole a toy truck from a store in the neighborhood. His mom made him walk back to the store, return the toy, and apologize, which that's fair. But his mom also told his father what happened, and he beat him with a belt again. And so Gacy's mother attempted to shield her son from her husband's abuse after this incident, but that led to his father calling him a sissy, a mama's boy, and saying that he would, quote, probably grow up queer, end quote. And his father also regularly belittled him and called him dumb and stupid in comparison to his sisters. And the documentary mentioned a very interesting thing of how his dad would give his mom attention, and even though it was sexual attention, Gacy was still almost envious of it because he wasn't getting any positive attention from his father. And so he ended up stealing his mom's underwear, and then she found out and she took it away, but also said that if she caught him with it again, she would when she caught him with it, she made him wear it and said that if she caught him with it again, she would make him run down the street wearing it.
That is not a good way to respond to finding that your child did that.
Right? Yeah. So between the two of them, it's resulted in a really messed up kid. But even though his father was regularly cruel to him, when Gacy was interviewed after his arrest, he denied that he hated him. He was like, no, I'm still love my father. I just wanted to make him proud. I'm just sad I never got the chance to do that. And so then when Gacy was 9, he was molested by a family friend who would take Gacy for a ride in his truck and then fondle him. He never told his father about this because he was afraid that his father would blame him for it, which I think is a very valid fear. Especially in his case. Gacy also had a heart condition, so he wasn't able to participate in school sports, and he was often the victim of bullying as a result. He assisted the school truant officer and volunteered to run errands for the teachers and neighbors, and when he was in 4th grade, he started having seizures that resulted in him blacking out, and he was even hospitalized for some of the episodes, and then in 1957, his appendix burst. And then also in 1957, a friend of Gacy's recounted a story where his father beat him with no provocation. And so out of nowhere, Gacy's dad started yelling at him for no reason and then started hitting him. His mother tried to stop the abuse, but she wasn't able to. And the friend recalled that Gacy, quote, put his hands up to defend himself, end quote, but never struck his father back, which makes sense because in that situation, like if you hit back, it only gets worse, which devastating, but understandable. And so between the ages of 14 to 18, it was calculated that he spent an entire year in the hospital as a result of all of the health issues he was experiencing. And so unsurprisingly, his grades suffered from missing so much school due to his health issues. His father thought that the episodes were a way to gain sympathy and even accused him of faking an episode while he was in the hospital recovering from one. And so even though he was in the hospital for a lot of time, his medical condition was never diagnosed. They never actually figured out what was going on with him, which I think is odd, but I also think that it's like a condition that kind of stemmed from the abuse. Like it was his way of coping with it.
Could it have been something like Munchausen's, I think it's called, or like something by folia de Munchausen's or by proxy?
Like maybe. I think it was more of like a coping mechanism where like he was like his body couldn't process what was what was happening to him. So as a result, he had these seizures blacking out so that he wouldn't have to process what was going on.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's my guesstimation. But yeah, those who were close to him never doubted that he had an illness. And then when Gacy was 18, he became involved in politics and started working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood. And his father did not like this and called him a patsy. And then during later interviews, Gacy admitted that his decision to do this may have come from a desire to gain acceptance from others that he wasn't able to get from his father. And then in 1978, he became the precinct captain for the whole neighborhood that he lived in, and he was very well known around his suburb, so he was able to like keep the dream of being well known around people. And so in the same year that he was 18, I'm not sure which year that would have been, but his father bought him a car. And so this car was in his father's name until Gacy was able to pay him back, which took several years. And his father would also take away the keys if he did something that his father didn't like. And so 2 years later, in 1962, Gacy bought an extra set of keys and used those to drive the car when the original set was confiscated. His father then took off the distributor cap and didn't give it back for 3 days once he found the copycat set of keys. And then once his father returned the distributor cap, Gacy drove to Las Vegas, Nevada, and found work in the ambulance service. He worked with them for a bit and then changed to work as a mortuary attendant, where he worked 3 months before going back to Chicago. And so during his time as a mortuary attendant, he slept in a cot behind the embalming room. He later confessed that one evening he climbed into the coffin of a deceased teenage boy where he embraced and caressed his body. This shocked him and prompted him to call his mom and ask to come home, and his father said he could, so that he did. When he returned home, he enrolled at Northwestern Business College despite not graduating high school. And he graduated college in 1963 and got a management trainee position working in the Nunn Bush Shoe Company. And then in 1964, he was transferred to Springfield, Illinois to work as a salesman, but was quickly promoted to manager of his department. And then in March of that same year, he got engaged to Marlon Myers, who was his coworker, and they got married in September 1964. They had only started dating in January of that year, so they got engaged 3 months after starting dating and married, I think that's 9 months later. So very quick turnaround. And also in 1964, Gacy started working with the organization of the Jaceys. So the Jaceys is a United States junior chamber, which is a leadership training service organization and civic organization for people between the ages of 18 to 40, according to Wikipedia. The documentary describes it as a way for young men to get involved with the community. It seems weird, but a lot of famous people have been part of the Jaceys. And so by April 1964, he was named Key Man. I don't know what that means. And that same year, he had his second homosexual experience, his first being when he was molested by a family friend. A colleague of his from the Jaycees took him out for drinks, then asked him to spend the night on his sofa, and then performed oral sex on him while he was drunk. So not a consensual sexual experience. In 1965, Gacy was the vice president of the Springfield Jaycees and was named the third most outstanding Jaycee in the state of Illinois. And then in 1966, Gacy's father-in-law bought 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, and offered him $15,000 a year plus a share of the profits. He accepted and moved out to Waterloo in the autumn. And Gacy said that he thinks about his father-in-law the same way as his dad, in that he can never please him, and so he was always working to try and please him. So I think that's why he took this job. And the $15,000 a year worked out to be $142,494.91 in today's currency, which that's one hell of a salary. So I can also understand why he took it for that reason. Gacy changed to the Waterloo Jaycees court charter and quickly rose through the ranks again and was given the name Colonel by his colleagues because he would often give them free chicken. He became chaplain of the Jaycees and then wanted to be president, and that kind of started a little bit of drama in the Jaycees. But then in March 1967, Marlon gave birth to their son Michael, and then in October 1968, she gave birth to their daughter Christine. Gacy described this time of his life as perfect because his achievements earned him approval from his father, because in 1967 his father told him, quote, "Son, I was wrong about you," end quote. So he's kind of like, all is well, I'm doing everything perfectly. However, not all was as it seems. The Jaycees' life had a dark side that involved wife swapping, prostitution, pornography, and drugs. And so I almost got you to spit out your drink, Nicole.
Plot twist. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, I'm not sure how many of the Jaycees are involved in this dark side, but I would imagine quite a few. Gacy was involved in... Yeah, he was involved in most.
He was almost everywhere on that one.
I know, I saw you try not to spit it out of the corner of my eye.
Holy shit. Anyways, carry on. Mm-hmm. This is a ride of a lifetime over here, not knowing all these details.
Right? And so it is just getting started.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So Gacy was involved in most, if not all, of these activities and was regularly cheating on his wife. Apparently, he also had a little club in his basement where he would invite fellow Jaycees to drink and play pool, which comes into play later on. So being the manager of 3 KFCs, and for those of you who don't know, it's Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's a fast food restaurant. Very yummy. And so he was in charge of hiring, and he only hired teenagers of both sexes, but would only socialize with the boys. And so Gacy would give them alcohol before making sexual advances on them, which he would say was a joke if they weren't receptive, kind of just laugh it off.
That's so gross.
Ugh. Yeah, so gross. And then in August 1967, Gacy committed his first sexual assault on a teenage boy. Gacy picked up 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, who was hitchhiking, and Gacy said that he was asking about stag films, which is just porn. But Gacy might have also offered to show him one because that's what he did with an earlier boy who he ended up not assaulting. So it's tough because in the documentary, you kind of have to take everything that he says with a grain of salt because he is a compulsive liar, and he will twist the truth so he doesn't look so bad. So yeah, some of this you just gotta take with a grain of salt. So Gacy took him to his house, gave Voorhees alcohol, and persuaded him to perform oral sex on him. And Gacy said, quote, he believes he went down on him as well, end quote. So Gacy abused several other kids over the next few months in very similar ways. And one kid he apparently encouraged to sleep with his wife before blackmailing him to perform oral sex on him. And then this part's really gross. But several teenagers were tricked into believing that Gacy was commissioned to carry out homosexual experiments for scientific research. And so he would like often pay the kids $50 for them performing like sexual things on him.
That's not nice.
Yeah,
No.
it's really not. And so then in March of 1968, Donald Voorhees came forward and told his father that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. He told the police, and Gacy was arrested and charged with oral sodomy to Voorhees and the attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynch. Gacy denied these accusations and took a polygraph test, which indicated that he was lying when he denied the charges against him. But we don't like polygraphs, so whatever. I also thought that sodomy was only for anal sex, but it is the crime of oral or anal sexual contact or penetration between persons or of sexual intercourse between a person and an animal.
Oh.
Yeah. Gross. I also don't understand why he wasn't charged with sexual assault instead of like specifically sodomy, but
yeah,
whatever. Gacy publicly denied the charges and said they were politically motivated because Donald Voorhees' father opposed Gacy's nomination as president of the Iowa's Jaycees. And so because of that, several Jaycees found Gacy's story credible and supported him in saying that he hadn't sexually assaulted young Donald Voorhees. That being said, on May 10th, 1968, he was indicted on the sodomy charge. In August 1968, Gacy persuaded 18-year-old Russell Schroeder to attack Donald Voorhees in an effort to discourage him from testifying at the upcoming trial. So Schroeder agreed to lure Voorhees to a secluded spot, spray mace in his face, and beat him up, and he was paid $300 for doing that. Voorhees, being so smart, he immediately reported this assault to the police and identified Schroeder as his assailant because they worked together, which was kind of stupid on Gacy's part. Schroeder was arrested and told police that Gacy paid him to do it. Gacy was then arrested and charged for hiring him to assault and intimidate Voorhees. And then on September 3rd, he was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the Psychiatric Hospital of the State University of Iowa. And 2 doctors examined him for over a period of 17 days, and they came to the conclusion that he had antisocial personality disorder, which Rebecca will be telling us a little bit more about in the second half of our episode. And the doctors also said that he was unlikely to benefit from medical treatment. He will repeatedly be in conflict with society, and he is mentally competent to stand trial. And so Gacy tried to flip the switch and say that he was the victim in the situation, that he was used, and that it like wasn't his fault because he had this disorder kind of thing, which is disgusting. But then on November 7th, 1968, he pled guilty to the charge of sodomy against Donald Voorhees, but not guilty to the other charges against him. And so the reason he pled guilty was because he thought he would only get probation if he changed his plea, because originally he had pled not guilty to the charge of sodomy. And so Gacy said that he and Voorhees did engage in sexual activities, but that Voorhees offered sexual services to him and that Gacy only accepted out of curiosity. No one believed that story, which is good. And Gacy was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd, 1968, and was sentenced to 10 years at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. The same day he was sentenced, his wife filed for divorce and requested their home, property, and subsequent alimony payments. The courts ruled in her favor, and their divorce was finalized in September 1969, and Gacy never saw his first wife or his children ever again. And when you Google those children, nothing comes up because they don't know really that Gacy was their father, and they want nothing to do with the limelight. They still will not talk to any of Gacy's family. She did a really good job of protecting them from him. Yeah.
Wow.
That's very understandable, honestly, especially knowing what came after that. So good on the mom for protecting them.
Yeah, she did a phenomenal job. And so when Gacy was in prison, he was a model prisoner, joined the Jaycees chapter in there, became head cook, supervised projects to improve conditions for the inmates, and installed a mini golf course in their rec yard. He was very excited about that. In June 1969, he applied for early release but was denied. He got his high school diploma in November of 1969. His father passed away on Christmas Day, but he wasn't told until 2 days later, which he was very upset about. He asked for compassionate leave to attend his dad's funeral but was denied. And this really impacted his personality because he felt like he had let his dad down when he died because he never amounted to anything or made him proud. And now he couldn't try to make him proud anymore. It was kind of just their relationship was stuck at where it was when he passed away. On June 18th, 1970, he was granted 12 months probation, even though he was only 18 months into his 10-year sentence. There were 2 conditions to his parole, which were that he got to live with his mother and he had a curfew of 10 p.m. So Gacy moved back to Chicago on June 19th and got a job as a short order cook in a restaurant.
They really screwed over the mom on that deal.
Right?
Like, you have to go live with your mom. Did the mom have any say in this? What if she's like, I don't want my child here?
I'm thinking she was okay with that. Like, I'm thinking she was the kind of mom who was like, my son can do no wrong. Like,
oh, wild.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't really know.
Okay.
So then on February 12th, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting another teenage boy. This kid said that Gacy had lured him into his car at a Greyhound terminal and drove him to his house where he tried to force the kid into sex. These charges were dismissed because the kid failed to appear in court. Somehow, the parole board didn't hear of this incident, so 8 months later, his parole ended and the records of his previous crimes were sealed, and he was a free man in society. Isn't that disgusting?
What? Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like no information was processed in my brain when I watched this documentary on him.
Yeah.
I thought I knew what he had done and the atrocities he's committed, but like it all makes sense now.
They only cover what happened like once he started killing, really.
Yeah.
Like they spend a little bit of time with Donald Voorhees and another guy. I can't remember his name. I think his name was Steve Nemmers.
Okay.
But like, and they talk briefly about this, but they don't highlight it in the fact that like all of these crimes could have been committed.
Wow. Yeah.
Had Illinois and Iowa court systems talked to each other, or had they like looked into his past at all.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So it's really upsetting because it could have all been avoided. Okay. So Gacy bought a house in Cook County in August 1971, which he and his mother moved into, and the address was 8213 Summerdale. And in October, he started dating Carol Hoff, who was a young divorcee with 2 daughters. They had previously dated in high school, I guess, and she was a friend of one of his younger sister. And so she moved into his house shortly after their engagement in November, and his mom moved out right before their wedding. So that would have been a weird couple months. Allegedly, he had a conversation with her about how he was bisexual and, quote, engaged in different things, end quote. But he wasn't gay because when he was ever asked if he had a homosexual relationship, he said no, because he'd only had oral or anal sex and there was, quote, no feelings there. There was no love, end quote. So it didn't count as homosexual because he wasn't in love with the boys he was having sex with, and that's why he thought he was bisexual.
Definitely not gay.
Yeah, definitely not gay. He hated, like, he has this like deep-rooted hatred for gay people, and so the way he would talk about them, like in the documentary, like was disgusting.
That's so messed up.
Yeah, I think it was one of those things where like he knew he was gay when he was younger, and then his dad was always like, that's the worst possible thing you could be. So then he also like took on that hatred of like, which is upsetting. But so he told his wife all that. She knew he had been incarcerated. I don't know if she knew why, or if he left out that like the boy was underage or what. But he said that he wanted to start their marriage off honestly, so that's why he told her. So then on January 2nd, 1972, Gacy picked up Timothy Jack McCoy, who was 15, from the Greyhound bus terminal and took him on a sightseeing tour of Chicago. He drove him back to his house and said McCoy could spend the night and he would drive him back to the terminal in the morning for his bus. Allegedly, they performed oral sex on each other. Gacy said that he woke up in the morning with McCoy standing in his door with a knife in his hand. Gacy jumped out of bed and McCoy raised both arms in surrender. And by doing so, the way he moved the knife accidentally cut Gacy's forearm. But Gacy has the scar to show that that's what happened. So Gacy twisted the knife from McCoy's wrist, banged his head against the bedroom wall, kicked him against his wardrobe, and walked towards him. And then McCoy kicked him in the stomach, and Gacy grabbed the young boy, wrestled him to the floor, stabbed him repeatedly in the chest as he straddled him with his body, and then Gacy buried him in his crawl space.
My guess about the scar is that the kid didn't stab him or cut him accidentally because he was like, oh, I surrender. It was probably from fighting back from that attack.
Right? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
That sounds more plausible.
Yeah. And so we learned that McCoy hadn't intended any harm to Gacy. He had just made breakfast for them and forgot to put the knife down before he woke Gacy up. And then during an interview in the 1980s, Gacy said that he felt drained after killing him, but also had an orgasm. And he added, quote, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill," end quote. So that kind of started his rampage.
It just feels gross.
Right?
That's all.
Yeah.
I just don't have anything to say because it just feels gross.
Yeah, I sat down and researched this all in one sitting, and by the end of it, I was like, I need to just have a shower. Like, I feel disgusting. And then I watched the documentary, and I was like, now I need to have a bleach bath. Like, I feel so gross. Okay, so on June 22nd, 1972, a week before his wedding, he was arrested and charged with battery after a young man told police that Gacy flashed a sheriff's badge at him, lured him into his car, and forced him to perform oral sex on him. These charges were dropped after the complainant tried to blackmail Gacy into paying money in exchange for dropping the charges. And then July 1st, 1972, Carol and John Wayne Gacy got married. Later, in 1972, he started his own construction business called PDM Contractors, where PDM stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance, and he hired almost exclusively young boys. I think it's important to mention that he's around 25 when all of this happens, because I thought he was way older. I didn't realize
I thought so
that,
too.
Yeah.
I always thought he was
picturing
in his,
like the
40s.
40s.
Yeah. I'm going to double check my math on that. But I'm fairly certain he was 25 when it happened. 30. He was about 30 now. So he was 25 when he first went to jail.
Okay, but still, that's like at least 10 years younger than I expected.
Right? Yeah, so he would have been like 38 when he was like finally put in prison. So yeah, in 1973, Gacy and one of his employees went to Florida to see a property that he had purchased. During the first night, Gacy raped the young boy. And when they came back to Chicago, this boy drove to Gacy's house where Gacy was working in the yard and started to beat him up. Gacy's mother-in-law stopped the kid and he drove away. Gacy told her and his wife that the attack happened because he refused to pay the young boy for the poor quality work that he had performed, not what had actually happened. The second time that Gacy killed wasn't until January 1974, so 2 years later. His victim was an unidentified teen boy with medium brown curly hair and was between the ages of 15 to 17. Gacy strangled him before putting his body in a closet. Gacy said that fluid leaked out of the boy's mouth and nose and stained the carpet in the closet. And so as a result, he started stuffing rags or their underwear in their mouths to prevent staining or any fluid leakage. He buried this young boy in the barbecue pit in his backyard. And this pit was dug out by Tony Antonucci, who worked for him. And so he started the pit and then came back a little while later. I'm not sure how much later. I'm assuming it was like a day or so. But the bottom was already filled with concrete, which he thought was very odd, but didn't think that there would be a body under there. And so Gacy was known as a gregarious, helpful person who was active in his community and hosted annual summer parties. He was also an important part of the Democratic Party and various Polish associations. He also got to meet Rosalind Carter and had a Secret Service clearance pin on his suit in the photos that were taken with her, which made the U.S. government really mad when it came to light what he had been doing to young boys because he had that pin that wasn't given to just anybody. And then he joined the Jolly Jokers Clown Club in late 1975 and created his character of Pogo the Clown. One thing we should note about his clown appearance was that he painted sharp corners on his clown makeup instead of the like rounded borders that professional clowns use not to scare children, which makes him all the more creepy as a clown. And so this clown club that he was a part of would perform at fundraising events and parades and entertain for hospitalized children. I wrote that really weirdly. And he was quoted saying, "But if I was in a bad mood, then it was bad for me to be a clown, because some of those kids can be little bastards, you know? You want to whack the shit out of them," end quote.
So, whoa.
Yeah, not great.
Whoa.
Yeah, kind of a despicable thing for a clown to say when he's like entertaining at like children's
parties. Your job is to be around children.
Right?
Whoa. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But he really enjoyed being a clown because he can do things as a clown that you can't do as a person. And he even said to the investigators, quote, "Clowns can get away with anything. Clowns can get away with murder," end quote.
This feels like a novel. Like, I know this was real and this actually happened, but it seems so absurd that it's fictional.
Yeah. And something that I had thought about, like, I thought he killed as a clown. I didn't realize that he wasn't as a clown when he killed.
Yeah.
I guess that we know, or that he's admitted, but I feel like he would have admitted to that.
Wow. Yeah, because like that's just the persona that's portrayed through media. This reminds me so much. This brings me back to that research. Remember with the two professors, sorry, side tangent. They were looking into the portrayal of serial killers in media and like tracking that. This is exactly that. Like, we see John Wayne Gacy as just a clown and killed as a clown. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like the actual shit that happened that like you need to know to understand to be disgusted in this man.
Well, like, and that's why I go into so much depth about like who he was just as a regular neighborhood man, because he was like revered in the neighborhood. No one thought he was capable of this. Everyone loved him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, continue. I'm fascinated. I feel like I'm learning all over again. I love it.
Right? It was so interesting because it was so different to the portrayal that I had already had of him.
Like, I already hated this man because I knew generally what he had done to some degree, but like this just adds a whole other aspect to it.
Yeah.
Like I'm viscerally unwell, and that doesn't happen often, I will say.
Yeah. It's just, and I'm so sorry because it is going to get so much worse.
Okay.
Yeah. He's just all sorts of messed up. But then in 1975, after having sex with his wife on Mother's Day, he told her that they would never again have sex. He then spent most of his evenings away from home, only returning early in the morning, and he told his wife that he was working late. His wife saw him bringing teenage boys into their garage and found gay porn in their house. She also started to question him about why he was hiring only young boys, to which he said in an interview, quote, "I'm accused of it so goddamn much, I might as well go out and do it," which I did, end quote. And so I think he wanted to kill and sexually assault young boys before being accused of it. And then I think that was his way of like justifying it, in air quotations, of why he did it, because I don't, that there's no way that was his like motivation because he'd been doing it for so long.
Yeah.
So then in July 1975, Gacy went to his employee, Anthony Antonucci, who had built the barbecue pit earlier. So he went to his house while he was home alone to check in on him because he had stepped on a nail at work the day before and hurt his foot. So they started wrestling because Gacy knew he was on the wrestling team at school. So weird. So weird. But also, when Bryce was living in the crew house with his boss, who's about the same age as like older than him as Gacy would have been from this guy, like they wrestled all the time, but it wasn't weird like this, you know? And so I'm not trying to excuse what he did. I'm just trying to say that it might not have been as weird as it was at the time, but knowing what we know about him makes it exponentially weirder.
Understandable.
Yes. So They were wrestling, and then Gacy wrestled him to the ground, cuffed his hands behind his back. Thankfully, one of the cuffs was loose, so Anthony was able to get his hand free and wrestled the key out of Gacy's hand and cuffed Gacy's hands behind his back. Gacy told him, quote, "You're the only one that not only got out of the handcuffs, but got them on me," end quote. And so they interview Anthony in the Netflix documentary, and like hearing him talk about that is so uncomfortable because he's like, that's something that's always stayed with me. And I'm like, yeah, as it would.
Wow.
Yeah, so once Gacy calmed down a little bit after being handcuffed, he got really mad. Anthony uncuffed him and Gacy left. And then 1 or 2 weeks after this attack, depending on the source, on July 31st, 1975, 17-year-old John Bukovich disappeared. And so the day before he disappeared, Bukovich threatened Gacy for over 2 weeks of back pay that he hadn't yet received. And then Gacy lured him to his house while his wife and stepchildren were away under the guise of settling the issue with the wages. And so Gacy somehow tricked the boy to cuff his hands behind his back. He strangled him to death and then buried his body under the concrete floor of his garage. Gacy also admitted to sitting on his chest for a while before killing him. Gacy drove Butkovich's car to an abandoned parking lot to make it look like he had run away. But the people who knew Bukovich thought that was super weird because his car had meant so much to him that he wouldn't, like if he was running away, he would have taken his car too. Gacy was questioned about Bukovich's disappearance and said that he and 2 friends had come to his apartment to demand his missing wages, but eventually left after they had reached a compromise. And then over the next 3 years, Bukovich's parents called the police over 100 times to investigate Gacy more. In October 1975, Gacy and his wife got into an argument over her not properly balancing a PDM checkbook, and she asked for a divorce. In March of 1976, their divorce was finalized, and Carol and her daughters moved out in February, the month before. So in April 1976, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared while walking home from school. He was gagged with a cloth, which caused him to die via asphyxiation. And then not long after Randall was abducted, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton disappeared as he was walking home from his sister's apartment. Both of these boys were buried in the same grave in the crawl space, as well as 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. On June 3rd, 1976, Gacy strangled 17-year-old Michael Bonin with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space. On June 13th, 16-year-old William Carroll was killed and buried under his kitchen. There were 3 other boys killed and buried under Gacy's kitchen between June 13th and August 6th. They ranged from 16 to 30 years old. On July 26, 1976, Gacy hired 18-year-old David Cram. On August 21st, Cram moved in with Gacy, and the following day he tricked Cram into putting on handcuffs while he was drunk. Gacy swung him around and told him he was going to rape him. Cram had been in the army for a year, so he kicked Gacy in the face and got out of the handcuffs. But the trick that Gacy used to handcuff this boy was he was like, I'm going to show you a magic trick where like I can put myself in cuffs behind my back and then get out of them. But he wouldn't, like he would have the key in his hand, so he would just like undo them. And then he would give the handcuffs to the boy and be like, now it's your turn, like you try and get out of them. But then they wouldn't be able to because they weren't trick handcuffs. 1 month later, Gacy appeared in Cram's bedroom and told him he was going to rape him. He said to him, quote, Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you gave me what I want, end quote. Cram resisted his attempts and moved out and quit his job at PDM Contractors, which is a month too late, in my opinion.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But at least he got out.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, I maybe would have moved out after the first incident, but that's just me.
Just a slight side note. How is he burying all these people under his already built house?
There's there's like a crawl space in between. So the house is lifted up above the foundation. So instead of like having a basement, it was just dirt.
I always thought when they said crawl space, because I knew that about John Wayne Gacy's where he buried the victims, I thought it was only under like his front porch. I had no idea this went under his entire house, but that makes so much more sense.
Yeah, I didn't realize it went under his entire house. I thought it was only like a piece of it because my uncle has a crawl space in his house that just is under a piece of it. But his is under the whole house, according to the layout that they show in the Netflix documentary of where they found each of the bodies.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So Gacy killed 2 more boys between August and October 1976. One was buried above the body of William Carroll. And then on October 24th, 1976, Gacy abducted and killed Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. They were strangled and buried in the crawl space. On October 26th, 19-year-old William Bundy appeared and was strangled and buried in the crawl space directly below Gacy's master bedroom. In December 1976, another PDM employee, Gregory Godzik, who was 17 at the time, disappeared. Gacy told his family that Godzik had run away and told him prior that that was his plan. So he kind of was like, oh yeah, he confided in me that he was going to run away. That's why he's missing. And they were like, yeah, that's fact. So on January 20th, 1977, John Zick, who was friends with Bukovic Godzik and worked for Gacy, he disappeared. He was buried directly above Godzik, and Gacy kept the ring worn by Zick in his dresser and sold his car to Mike Rossi, who also worked for Gacy. And between December 1976 and March 1977, Gacy killed an unidentified man who was around 25 years old. He was buried beneath the body of 20-year-old John Prestige, who was killed on March 15th. After killing Prestige, Gacy killed another unidentified man who was buried parallel to the wall of Gacy's crawl space underneath the entrance to his house. And then in April 1977, Gacy became engaged to another woman who he had been dating for the past 3 months, and she moved into his house, but they called off the engagement in June that same year by mutual agreement, probably because he was creepy. In July, Gacy killed 19-year-old Matthew Bowman, who he buried in the crawl space with the tourniquet still around his neck. In August 1977, John Zick's car was traced to Gacy's house because the kid who he had sold it to after killing Zick was living and working with him. So Gacy told police officers that Zick had sold it to him in February with the explanation that he needed to leave town, and the police didn't pursue it any further. During the autumn and winter of 1977, Gacy started dating Carol Hoff again, but by the next year she was engaged to a different man, so it also went nowhere. And by the end of 1977, Gacy killed 6 more young men between the ages of 18 and 21, and they are 18-year-old Robert Gilmore, 19-year-old John Mowry, 21-year-old Russell Nelson, 16-year-old Robert Winch, 20-year-old Tommy Bowling, and 19-year-old David Talsma. On December 30th, 1977, Gacy abducted 19-year-old Robert Donnelly from a bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy drove him home, raped him, tortured him, and repeatedly dunked his head in the bathtub until he passed out and then revived him. Donnelly survived this encounter and later testified that he was in so much pain that he had actually asked Gacy to kill him to, quote, get it over with, end quote, and Gacy replied with, I'm getting around to it. Donnelly reported this assault, and Gacy was questioned about it on January 6, 1978. Gacy admitted they were having slave sex together, but said everything was consensual. The police believed him, and no charges were filed.
There is like no way that the police were not corrupt. There are so many people from his company going missing, and there are so many both rape convictions and accusations about him. And then every time he says, oh, they ran away. Oh, I was his confidant. Oh, it was consensual. It was a little kinky. Why are the police okay with that?
Right? I think it's because he was such a, like, important man in the neighborhood. Like, he was in such high standing in this JC's corporation of whatever. And so they never expected that he would actually be this terrible.
Yikes.
Either way, they need to kind of... Yeah, not ideal. So then in February 1978, Gacy killed William Kindred, who was the last of his victims to be buried in his crawl space. In March 1978, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall into his car. Rignall was chloroformed, taken to Gacy's house, raped, tortured, and repeatedly chloroformed into unconsciousness. Rignall survived with permanent liver damage and like burns on his face. I don't know if they were permanent, but the photo of him after was really upsetting. He did inform the police, but they didn't investigate Gacy because Rignall was a gay man and they didn't believe that rape could happen between men. At least that was the theory. Rignall remembered what car Gacy drove, so he followed him around and back to his house. Police then issued an arrest warrant, and Gacy was arrested on July 15th. He was facing an impending trial for a battery charge against Rignall when he was arrested for the murders in December. Gacy later confessed that he had thrown 5 bodies off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River in 1978, one of which he thought landed on a passing barge, and only 4 of the 5 were ever found. 3 of the 4 are 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke, who was killed mid-June and found June 30th, 19-year-old Frank Ladigan, who was found November 12th, 20-year-old James Mazzara, who disappeared November 24th and was found December 28th, and then the 4th one is Robert Peast. And so on December 11th, 1978, Gacy visited a pharmacy to discuss a remodeling deal with the owner of the store. And while discussing this deal, a 15-year-old employee named Robert Jerome Peast overheard him saying that he hires teenage boys. Peast told his mom that some contractor wants to talk to him about a job, and he left the store to see Gacy. And when he didn't return, his family filed a missing persons report, and the owner of the pharmacy said it was most likely Gacy who he was meeting with. The Des Plaines police were convinced that Gacy was behind Peast's disappearance, and they did the smart thing and checked his record. Finally, they decided to look into this man. They saw that he had an outstanding battery charge in Chicago and had served a prison sentence for sodomy.
The rap sheet that would be, though, sorry to interrupt, the rap sheet that would be if the police actually did their jobs leading up to this, though.
Right?
Like, it wouldn't be those 2 charges that, he got away with or something like?
Yeah.
He served 18 months for? Oh, my God.
Exactly. And, they mentioned in the documentary that, his rap sheet was mostly, assault and battery, and none of it was, inherently sexual.
Yeah.
Which, is mind-boggling, because almost every single boy was he, sexually assaulted me.
Yeah.
And they were like, we'll just change that to assault and battery. So they didn't think it was, they just thought he was, getting into bar fights kind of thing.
I am unwell, but carry on.
Yes, we are getting close to the end. Gacy denied this when the police called. They either called or went to his house. I don't know. The source that I read and the documentary said different things. He said he was unable to come to the station now because his uncle had just died, but promised to come there later. I think he had just killed Peast. So he was he said something weird about them being cruel in the time of death or whatever. So I think there was a death. It was just not his uncle. And then at 3:30 a.m., he showed up covered in mud and claimed to be in a car accident. Turns out he slid into the ditch when he was dumping Peast's body in the river, which we find out in episode 3 of the Netflix documentary. But no one was there to talk to him because it was 3:30 in the morning. So he went back to his house and then came back around 11 a.m. the next morning. They told him that he could either give them his keys to his house or they would bust the door down because they have a search warrant for his house. And in the Netflix documentary, you actually get to see the inside of his house. And he has clown paraphernalia everywhere, and it is so creepy. He still denied any involvement, but gave them a written statement of his movements on December 11th. On December 13th, they searched his house and found John Zick's class ring, various driver's licenses, handcuffs, books on homosexuality and pederasty, pedophilia, a syringe, clothing that didn't belong to him, a 6mm Beretta starter pistol, and a photo receipt from the pharmacy that Peast worked for in the garbage and was later found out belonged to Peast. Sex toys and torture toys, as one of the investigators called them. And so they ended up having to let him go because they hadn't actually found anything that would allow them to charge him, because at that time they didn't realize that the photo receipt tied Peast to the house.
But he had his ring.
He had a different kid's
evidence.
Ring.
And so many driver's licenses.
Because it just had to be for him. It didn't no fucking way.
Yeah. Which is super upsetting. But now they have all of this evidence. And And so the next day, the investigators received a phone call from Michael Rossi, who bought Zick's car. And so he told him about Gregory Godzik disappearance and that Charles Hatula was found drowned in an Illinois river last year and had worked for PDM. So he was kind of like, hey, these are all of my friends who've gone missing that have worked for Gacy. And then on December 15th, they learned about Jeffrey Rignall's assault. They learned about the disappearance of John Zick from Gacy's ex-wife. I don't know. I forgot about that little tidbit. I don't know how she knew about his disappearance. And then John Zick's ring just had his initials, JAS, so it didn't actually have his name on it. So then once they found out that John Zick had disappeared, they were like, oh, his initials are JAS, and this is a ring from the high school that he went to that also has the initials JAS on it. By December 16th, Gacy was becoming friends with the detectives who were tasked with watching him. So he was like, even though they let him go, he was constantly being tailed by officers. And so they would go out for food and drinks at restaurants and at his home. Like if Gacy was out eating, he would just like invite them over. And knowing that the officers weren't going to arrest him for something trivial, he broke many traffic laws and was, quote, driving like a maniac, end quotes, just to kind of like toy with them a little bit. And then on December 17th, they interviewed Michael Rossi, and as they started talking to more people, they learned that there were 4 or 5 other boys who were missing and had worked for Gacy. During the early hours of December 18th, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives to breakfast at a restaurant. At one point, Gacy said, he said his quote about clowns can get away with murder during that breakfast. And then later that day, he was showing visible signs of stress, of being followed by the police officers, which was kind of like their plan. They were kind of like pushing him to do something so they could catch him in the act. Rossi was interviewed again that day, and he told detectives that in the summer of 1977, Gacy had him spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of his house. Super weird. Why would you need 10 bags of that? On December 19th, police were compiling evidence for a second search warrant of his home. That afternoon, Gacy invited his surveillance officers into his house. Very dumb on his part, because that's where they saw the TV suspected to belong to John Zick as well, and a smell that could be rotting corpses once the heat kicked on, because the first time they were in his house, the heat wasn't on.
No.
Gross.
Oh my God. One, stupid, like you said. You're an idiot for bringing them in. But maybe like he was just so unaware of the fact that it smelled like death every time the heat turned on.
I was going to say, like, did he not notice the smell of rotting bodies under his house? Like, did he just live with that? Because I've heard it's the worst smell ever.
Yeah. He must have just gone nose blind to it, right? Like, or he liked it.
Oh, I don't want to think about that.
Yeah, sorry.
You've had to think about it just for all this research, so you can subject it to us a little.
I have had some weird dreams lately. I will tell you that. So yeah, they brought David Cram back in for an interview to ask if he had ever seen John lose his temper, because they knew that Cram had worked and lived with him. So Cram told officers that he had spread lime in the crawl space and been asked to dig trenches that were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep in the basement, or in the crawl space. And he changed directions, and Gacy lost his mind. He was supposed to dig like only in this spot, but then he was like, oh, why don't I dig here? And Gacy was like, don't do that, because he could have dug up bodies. David Cram also told police officers about the attempted rape in 1976. And then on December 20th, Gacy showed up at his lawyer's office disheveled, and his lawyers, they never really thought he was innocent, which was interesting to hear from like a defense lawyer's perspective, because I'd never heard them actually say like, oh, by this point we were like fully convinced he had done it, so we were just trying to like get him the least sentence that he could get, kind of thing.
Do you think this was an after the fact thing, and they're like, ah shit, we can't let anyone know that we like thought he was innocent, or like he didn't do it? I'd be curious.
Until this point, maybe.
Okay.
But after this meeting, definitely not.
Okay.
Because they kind of confronted him with a newspaper with Pete's face on it, and like Gacy got really uncomfortable and asked for a drink. So he sat down, picked up the newspaper talking about Robert P.'s disappearance and said, quote, "This boy is dead. I've been a judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people. Now I want to be my own judge, jury, and executioner. I want to tell you everything that happened," end quote. So over the next couple hours, he gave his lawyers a confession going into each victim individually and ended up drinking the entire rest of the bottle of whiskey they gave him, and then he fell asleep.
Holy shit,
So,
he folded easy.
Yeah, right? He'd only been followed for like 9 days.
I guess that would get to someone when they were actively killing like once every 3 days. But
Yeah.
oh my god, like
Yeah.
I'm speechless. I am trying to say something, but I can't. There's no words for what I'm feeling right now.
Yeah, no, I feel you. So at this point, his lawyers arranged a psychiatric appointment for him at 9 a.m. with the hopes that he would get committed into a mental hospital, because they were like, as lawyers, we can't really like say he confessed, like we're his defense lawyers, but also we don't want him on the street because like he's done so many terrible crimes. And they invited the officers that had been following him around into their office and told them, like, don't let Gacy leave under any circumstances. Like, he's out to lunch. Like, you cannot do that. But they couldn't tell him why. And then when Gacy woke up, his lawyers told him that he confessed to killing 30 plus people. And he shook his head and said, quote, "Well, I can't think about this right now. I've got things to do," end quote. And he left their office. He drove around to a bunch of different spots, and the police finished their formal draft of their second search warrant. Due to his erratic events that day, the surveillance officers thought he was going to commit suicide, so they wanted to bring him into custody to prevent that. So they ended up arresting him for possession and distribution of marijuana, because when he stopped at a gas station, he gave a bag of marijuana to the gas station attendant. And then the gas station attendant like gave it to the officers that were following him, kind of like, "It's illegal for me to have this. I don't want it. Here you go." And so they were just trying to get like some sort of control over him. Yeah, Nicole?
That's such an odd thing to do, I will say. Like, who's just handing out little baggies of weed?
Yeah, he's like, it had 3 joints in it, according to the TV show, and it was something like, he's like, "They can't catch me," or "I can't have this, like, there are police officers following me." Like, it was something really odd.
Just toss it in the, like, in water. Throw it out. Why are you handing it to another human being?
They haven't
throw it under the crawl space. You've thrown other crimes under there.
Like, possession of marijuana is the least of your problems right now.
Yeah. Oh my
Like, you have
gosh.
29 bodies in your basement. Like, I don't know what you want. So either way, at 4:30 p.m. on December 21st, a judge signed the search warrant because of the smell and the photo receipt linking Robert Peace to the home, and like all of the other evidence they found linking to all the other boys who've gone missing. So police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home to find Robert Peace. They found that Gacy had unplugged his sump pump and the crawl space was flooded with water. So they had to drain the crawl space before they started digging, which was kind of dumb on their part, because on Gacy's part, because once they drained it, there was like a ton of worms, and they were like, "What are worms doing in the crawl space of a house?" And so it kind of like led them to the bodies a little bit. So they started digging in, I think, the southwest area of the crawl space, found putrefied flesh and a human arm bone within minutes. They moved to a different corner and found what they thought was a knee, and then they moved to another corner and found 2 leg bones. After Gacy was told that they found human remains in his house, he told officers that he wanted to, quote, "clear the air," end quote. So in the early hours of December 22nd, 1978, Gacy confessed that since 1972, he had committed 25 to 30 murders, of who he claimed were teenage runaways or male prostitutes. We don't know how true that is, because he lies. And I feel like maybe the unidentified boys were either runaways or male prostitutes because they're unidentified, which is really sad, but unfortunately a realistic thing. Gacy thought that he could manipulate the police and not get in as much trouble if he told them what they wanted to hear. He was also able to draw a map to where he buried each person and the few that he put in the river. So he was kind of like word vomiting everything that he had done in the hopes that like his sentence would get reduced. Stupid. between December 22nd and 29th, 27 bodies were recovered from his property. They had basically gutted his house searching for the bodies. Excavations were postponed until March, and then on March 9th, they found the body of a 28th victim buried in his barbecue pit, and then on March 16th, they found the skeletal remains of another victim under his dining room floor. And so 26 bodies were found in the crawl space, one was found in the addition, one under the barbecue pit, and one from the garage, for a total of 29 bodies in his house. And so on April 10th, 1979, Gacy's house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was demolished. Thankfully.
Good.
Yeah.
That would be some horror museum, true crime, weird.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really, really glad they demolished it. Which they basically had to, because they kind of thought there were bodies like in the walls. Like they were searching every nook and cranny of the house to like,
Wow.
because there were so many in the basement and like in the garage and around his yard that they were like, there could be bodies anywhere.
Yeah, especially if he's like building his house essentially and adding all of these things on himself, being in the contracting world.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So 9, I think it's about 9. The documentary says 9. Other sources say like 7. Some say 8. So I'm going to say 9 of his victims have never been identified. Robert Peace's body was found on April 9th, 1979, tangled in roots on the edge of the Des Plaines River. Oh, and the documentary shows that they were all given a funeral and burial. The state of Illinois kind of covered that so that they wouldn't be...
That's nice.
They were given a proper burial, considered how they were killed.
Yeah, very nice.
So then, on February 6th, 1980, Gacy was brought to trial and charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garapeau or Lewis, I'm not sure, and the jury was selected from Rockford, Illinois, due to the press coverage in Cook County. And then before his trial, Gacy spent 300 hours with doctors trying to determine if he was mentally competent to stand trial. They found that he was sane and fully in control of his actions. Something was said in the last episode of the documentary where it was said in front of the jury that if they found him not criminally responsible due to insanity, that he would get released to the world, kind of thing, or that was their understanding. Like, I don't know, I don't think those were the right words, but it was kind of like he wouldn't end up going to jail. And so they told the jury to disregard that, but that would be very, very difficult to hear, especially after hearing all of his cases. So I'm wondering if that's why he was sentenced the way he was. And so he was also interviewed from November 1979 to April 1980 by a member of his legal defense team. And so they have over 60 hours of the conversation recorded, which is what the Netflix documentary was based on. And so in his trial, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found him guilty of 33 charges of murder. And he was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child. So that's why I think the jury kind of went that way, is because they were like, we don't want this man out in the world.
Honestly, when it comes to how many people he killed and how brutally, like, I'm all for getting mental health treatment, but this man should have absolutely no chance of getting out. I completely agree that he just needs to be put in prison. Like they said when they first arrested him, I don't think there is treating this man.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. So the next day, March 13th, the jury deliberated for only 2 hours to decide sentencing. Gacy was sentenced to death for the 12 counts of murder on which the prosecution wanted this penalty. And his date of execution was June 2nd, 1980. I don't remember why there's differentiation between like some counts of murder resulted in the death penalty and some didn't. I think it had to do with murders that were in Illinois, but I don't know. I don't remember. So Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he was on death row for 14 years. He filed so many motions and appeals, all of which were denied, thankfully. He also started to paint in prison, and he ended up selling his paintings for between $200,000 to $20,000. And I'm hoping that they got sold after he died, because it would make me so mad if he was still alive and getting that money.
Some of those paintings, if I remember correctly, were also at the Museum of Death I went to in New Orleans. And it is just like, again, like I knew like, oh, Pogo the Clown, he's a serial killer that dressed like a clown. But I feel like I would have felt so more uncomfortable just looking at those, knowing all of this that I know now.
Right? I really want to go to that death museum. It sounds fascinating.
We should road trip. We go to Salem, Massachusetts, New Orleans for the death museum, and in Los Angeles for their death museum.
Yes, I'm down. So Gacy was moved to the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill on May 9th to be executed. Before his execution, the chemicals they were going to use mysteriously solidified. So spooky. I was listening to ghost episodes that day and I was like, what? Who had a play in that? But they had a whole bunch of new like technicians working that day. They think they just mishandled the chemicals a little bit.
Is that like a common error that could happen with the chemicals being used, or?
Yes, but like I don't know of any other cases in which it happened.
Okay.
But super weird. So they had to try again 10 minutes later. Over 1,000 people gathered outside the center to watch the execution, some in support, some against, as usual. Gacy's last words were, quote, "Kiss my ass." Very true to character.
Classic.
And what'd you say? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
I said classic.
Yeah,
like,
100%.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so, thankfully, at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994, he was pronounced dead. After he was dead, his brain was removed and given to Dr. Helen Morrison, who was a witness for the defense at his trial and had interviewed Gacy and other serial killers trying to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. But the examination of his brain showed no abnormalities, so it didn't really help her research at all. And that's pretty much it. I have lists of all of the boys that he killed, both identified and not identified, that I'm going to put on our website so that you guys can look. The unidentified ones shows where they were buried and the identified ones doesn't, but it does show the age they were and I believe the date they died or were killed. So head on over to our website for some gruesome images. I'm also going to see if I can find an image of like the crime scene reconstruction of the crawl space and where all the bodies were found, because that was crazy to look at. But yeah, that was John Wayne Gacy. I'm sorry that took an hour and 9 minutes and was very traumatizing, but you're welcome.
It was informative. I feel like I've learned something that I can warn people to not learn about later in life.
Yeah.
Like,
you know, through our episode, and then you're good. Journey gave all the good information.
You just need to hear it once. You just need to hear Journey tell you it once. And then that's all you need to know.
And that's good to go. Yeah. I was telling my mom, I was like, yeah, we're recording this like really gross guy. She's like, yeah, I saw your Instagram story and I really don't want to listen. And I was like, yeah, I know.
No. I think it's important to listen though, because you wouldn't understand what went on and what these like boys suffered basically until you hear it all.
Exactly. And I feel like it's important for the victims. And that was something that the documentary did a really good job of, was like there were family members who went on there and were like, we were kind of upset with how like the news coverage of this trial, because it focused so much on Gacy and not on the victims. Yeah. So that's why like if the victim was identified, I wanted to say his name because it's important and upsetting that this was how he was killed.
Keeps the name out there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, thank you for really gripping us with that.
You're welcome.
There were many moments where my jaw was just on the ground. Yeah. Listeners couldn't have seen that, but oh my good Lord.
This one would have been a good one to videotape.
Yeah. This is a side note too, but there was an instance where Journey, you were saying something like he was stupid or something like that. You basically did like a finger snap and you were like stupid, like explaining like burying a child under a thing and like getting himself caught.
Yeah,
Incredible.
literally.
That would be the best reaction gif ever.
I'll recreate it for you.
Yeah. But okay, well, thank you for all of that and everything that was. We're going to shift it over to Rebecca now. Hopefully give us some insight into maybe why he did this. I don't know if we ever will know why he did this, but can you maybe answer some questions as to whether psychopathy was an option for that?
Absolutely. So for starters, super slight spoiler for the end, psychopathy did play a bit of a role. But just to get started, like we've all heard the term psycho or psychotic, like saying, oh, that guy is psycho. And it's kind of just thrown around and used by culture really nonchalant. But no one really, I guess not no one, but it's kind of hard to actually know what being psychopathic genuinely means just because we throw this term around so frequently. So, psychopathy is generally defined as a mental disorder that's largely characterized by a lack of remorse and or empathy, grandiosity, impulsivity, deceitfulness, irresponsibility, an increased risk for violent or aggressive behaviors, and a disregard for the well-being or rights of others. So, right off the bat, Gacy seems to hit all those targets. However, it is important to note that psychopathy in and of itself is not actually a recognized, like, diagnosable condition according to the American Psychological Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Super duper mouthful. The DSM-5 is what this is.
I keep forgetting that that's the actual name of it. I was like, holy cow.
I know, it is long.
Yeah.
But we have discussed it a little bit in previous episodes, but as like a slight refresher, the DSM-5 is the standard classification tool of mental disorders that's used by mental health professionals in the Western countries. And it contains basically all of the mental health conditions and disorders that one can formally be diagnosed with by a clinician and treated for.
One interesting thing with this too is it's always being updated. Not always, but it is a consistent thing that's being updated.
Yeah, I think I think DSM-5 was released in 2013. That's the latest, and I think before that it was like 2000 or like the 90s or something. But it is an updated manual. So in the DSM-5, psychopathy is not actually listed, but it's basically encompassed by a disorder called antisocial personality disorder, ASPD for short, which, Journey, is what you had said John Wayne Gacy was actually diagnosed with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, according to the DSM-5, I'm just going to quote it directly what ASPD is. Quote, the essential feature of antisocial personality disorder is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others that begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood, unquote. So basically, one cannot formally be diagnosed with ASPD unless they showed really antisocial behaviors throughout their childhood as well. But interestingly, despite part of the diagnostic criteria being that these behaviors have to have been exhibited through childhood, individuals under the age of 18 actually cannot be diagnosed with ASPD. So instead, for individuals under the age of 18, there's actually a disorder called conduct disorder, or CD, which is diagnosed when a child or adolescent shows an ongoing pattern of aggression towards others, as well as commits serious violations of rules and social norms at home, in school, and with peers of their age.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How was he able to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder? Because I don't know that he would have been diagnosed with conduct disorder as a kid.
Yeah, so I've kind of learned, like I was reading through the DSM and just the research I was doing, and even though they say like need to have had a conduct disorder, the DSM recognizes that a lot of kids probably aren't going to be formally diagnosed with this. And so they kind of just say, like, there's enough evidence to support that they could have exhibited a conduct disorder. So if they had like friends and families who could verify or corroborate that, like, he did this and this and this and this, he had no respect for authority, da 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 da.
Right.
Even without a formal diagnosis as a kid, you could still be diagnosed with ASPD.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is 4 criteria within the DSM-5 that are needed to be diagnosed with ASPD. And just because some of them do align with psychopathy, which is why they're so interrelated, I'm just going to read out all of the symptoms that are listed in criterion A that are commonly associated with both of them. But just a quick note that in order to be formally diagnosed with ASPD, you only actually need to demonstrate 3 of the 7 items in Part A, and then also have B, C, and D. But all of the basically traits you could have for ASPD are failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. 2 is deceitfulness as indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. 3 is impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. I have a lot of trouble with the word failure. I apologize. 4 is irritability and aggressiveness, which is indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults. 5 is recklessness, disregard for safety of self or others. 6 is consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. And finally, 7 is a lack of remorse as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. So I think that's really interesting, especially after hearing what you had to say about John Wayne Gacy. I think he has like all 7 of these.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There was only one, the consistent irresponsibility, because like he had his own business and it was doing very well at the time of arrest. Like it was almost $1 million business by then.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so he definitely seems to have been responsible in that sense. Like he knew how to plan ahead. And this is similar to which is why it's like you don't have to have all 7 of these to be considered with ASPD, because think of Ted Bundy. Like he was also very organized and methodical.
Yeah.
It's kind of fun that you can pick and choose, though. You don't need all 7. You can shop around a bit.
Yeah, I know. It's like, ooh, I want these 3. These ones seem not as bad as the rest, so that's mine. But just moving on from those items of ASPD, even though individuals with psychopathy likely all or mostly do present with ASPD, not everyone with ASPD may present with psychotic symptoms or psychopathy. Because, as we had said multiple times, only 3 of the 7 criterion A are required as part of an ASD or ASPD diagnosis. And some of the symptoms of psychopathy are not even described by this diagnostic tool. So part of the reason that ASPD is not fully encompassing of psychopathy is because it fails to expand the criteria into personality traits. So instead of focusing on observable behaviors only, such as like the impulsivity or lack of financial responsibility, hurting others, personality traits that are indicative of psychopathy that are not measured include callousness, remorselessness, and narcissism, which are not inherently observable from an outside view. So just because psychopathy is not included in the DSM-5 doesn't actually mean that it's not still heavily researched. And it is still largely considered to be its own disorder. I think there's current psychological debates about whether or not it should have its own diagnosis within the next DSM revision. Obviously, because so much more research on it has come out since the last one, which was 2013. But yeah, there's still there's a lot of research on psychopathy, but just like most other disorders and diseases, the results are still out on whether nature or nurture have a bigger effect on someone's likelihood to get psychopathy. But again, just like most disorders, it is probably a combination of the two that is causing it. So there's an increasing amount of research that actually suggests that while psychopathy, it is like a nurture thing, like growing up in John Wayne Gacy's childhood probably meant he was much more likely, as someone who was already predisposed to psychopathy, he was probably much more likely to be violent because he experienced this violent, terrible past. But just aside from nurture for a second, there's an increasing amount of research that suggests that psychopathy could actually be a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects the brain's paralimbic system, which contains the brain structures that are involved in the functioning of emotional processing, goal setting, motivation, and self-control. So there's a researcher that I really want to kind of look into more of his work because he sounds like kind of a pioneer in the field of sorts. His name is Dr. Kent Keel, and he's currently one of the leading researchers on this topic of kind of using brain imaging and MRIs to see physical differences in psychopaths' brains than the normal person. And he also helped form a company called Mindset, which is a neuroscience and law consulting group that aids lawyers and judges on the intersection of neuroscience and law and the appropriate use of neuroscience in the courtroom, which I feel like if we had this kind of science and education when like John Wayne Gacy was going through the courts, you know, I don't know if I would have wanted it. I don't know if it would have helped John Wayne Gacy. So I'm not sure. But I think that research is super cool. And I'm not going to talk a lot more about it just because it's all super complicated brain talk. But psychopathy might look different in the brain than neurotypical. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting if they did have it when Gacy was like on trial because I see what you're saying about like why you don't want it because then it might have like gotten him off on like an insane charge or whatever. But it still would have been nice to know definitively like what is going on. And I wonder if they
absolutely.
Do you think they still have his brain? Like, could
I was gonna say, could this have been a post-mortem autopsy?
I'd say they probably do still have his brain. I honestly don't see why they would get rid of that.
Yeah.
But I think because it was a functional MRI and looking at like the activity in the brain, I don't think it's something they could do post-mortem.
Fair enough.
Makes sense.
But yeah, I know I say I don't want this stuff when Gacy's alive because I don't want Gacy out. But everyone deserves a fair trial. And if we could confirm that it was not completely his fault, then yeah, he deserves better. But he doesn't right now because we didn't know this before. Yeah, but just moving on from that. So now that we've accepted that even though it's not in the DSM-5, psychopathy is still very much a real thing, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about statistics because I love statistics. So in the general American population, studies have generally shown that around 1.2% of adult men and 0.3 to 0.7 of adult women exhibit clinically significant levels of psychopathic traits. And this sort of sounds scary, but also significant levels of psychopathic traits. Psychopathy is kind of considered a spectrum disorder. So like we were saying, you could have the bare minimum to be considered it, or you could have like 10 out of 10 of the symptoms. So there's a very big level, but if you're on the minimum threshold to the highest end, that's considered technically psychopathic. And I did have real numbers. I have real numbers. So yes, within the United States, with 1.2% of adult men and around 0.5% of adult women, we'll say, that would make approximately 3 million adults living in the U.S. Considered a psychopath, which is interesting.
And quite a few.
Yeah, and so I believe that study came out. When did that one come out? I think that one might have come out in 2020, but it was strictly related to the United States, and it was just one study. So, obviously, all of these are estimates based on like a large sample size. So we're kind of generalizing, but it's still very interesting. But there was another study that I had looked at that was a meta-analysis of a bunch of studies from all over the world. But really, I think it was mostly like America, Canada, UK, like where we're doing the primary research on psychopaths. But this meta-analysis was done in 2021, and it found that of all of the samples they looked at, which I think was approximately like almost 12,000 people in total, about 1 in 22 people in the world may have significant levels of psychopathic traits. So a few people in every university classroom.
Yeah. Even just every like public school classroom.
Yeah. True. If you're sitting on a bus with 25 people, one of them is likely to have. Yeah.
Wild. I mean, like, I'm thankful that right now we don't have a lot of like serial killers and stuff. The US does have their own issues. But it's crazy that 1 in 22 people is like technically a psychopath.
They could be, you know?
Yeah.
Isn't there some crazy stat too, or this could be absolutely nothing, about passing at least like one killer in your life, something like that? Like, it's bound to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard that one. I would have to look it up to confirm it, but and I'm not using this statistic to say all people with psychopathic traits are bad, because a lot of research has shown that most people with psychopathic traits are not going to commit these violent crimes.
Yeah.
But knowing that people with psychopathic traits are 2 times more likely to be imprisoned on these crimes than the average person, it can still be a little frightening, which does add to the stigmatism of it. So we need to change the conversation, but it's just really complicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for a little bit more statistics, going back to the US population for a second, even though it was only about, in general, I guess like 2% of the population, of the general population, being with psychopathic traits, these figures rise when we're looking at the US prison population, in which there's estimated to be around 15 to 25% of inmates who demonstrate the psychopathic characteristics. So it does significantly rise when we're looking at a prison population. And again, it is related to the fact that there's a lot more callousness and kind of selfishness in this disorder. So it's kind of like, I'll do whatever I need to with disregard for others to get ahead my own way, even if there's legal consequences. But yeah, just to kind of move on from the criminal psychopaths for a minute, because again, like, there are people that live with this that are still decent people, just living their lives. There was a study conducted in 2012 by a Dr. Kevin Dutton, and this aimed to study which professions have the highest and lowest proportions of psychopaths. And so through an online survey using the Levinson Self-Report Psychopathy Scale, which is just a tool to measure psychopathy traits, Dutton collected data from 5,400 participants in the UK, just from the general population. And what he found was that of the people who responded, so of the 5,400, the highest level of psychopathic traits, and just forewarning, he picked the top 10 and then the top bottom. Like he didn't just like pick and choose numbers, but the top 10 professions with the highest levels of psychopathic traits were CEOs, lawyers, radio or TV personalities, salespeople, surgeons, journalists, priests, police officers, chefs, and civil servants. I thought priests was fascinating.
Yeah, because everything else like kind of makes sense, where they're willing to do what needs to get done to get ahead, regardless of everyone else. But you think of a priest as someone who like help you,
almost like the opposite.
Yeah.
Like, in terms of what they are supposed to stand for.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that was super neat. I did, like, I've heard that figure before about, oh, the most psychopaths in the society are CEOs. I've heard that before, and it does kind of make sense. Like, they're at the top. They didn't get there just by being good at what they do. Maybe they did. I don't know. I can't generalize. But to the opposite effect of that, he had found that the 10 professions that scored the lowest on levels of psychopathic traits included social health assistants, so I guess like healthcare workers, nurses, therapists, artisans, stylists, charity workers, teachers, creative artists, physicians, and accountants.
I would put accountants in the highest psychopathic traits, because I feel like I would switch that and priests in my mind. That feels like those should be mixed. I don't know why.
I know, because like when you're looking at these two lists, one of them is very much like white collar.
Yeah, it's very corporate. I was just thinking that.
Corporate.
Yeah.
And then the other one is very like free-spirited, like helping others, like, oh, I'm a teacher, oh, I'm a painter. Like, these are all very, like, I'm not saying teaching is a liberal art, but you know what I mean? Yeah. It's not white collar corporate kind of world.
Exactly.
So that's just so fascinating how our traits lead us to these completely different professions.
Well, and if you think about the pay gap between them, like, CEOs and lawyers are getting paid way more than teachers and charity workers. So I wonder if there's something like,
does that say anything about the system though that we're in? You know what I mean? So many questions.
And kind of going off of what we were saying about like corporate versus not corporate, there were further studies, and I've also linked them. I didn't mention them all directly in my notes, just because there'd be a lot of names thrown at you, but I did link all of these studies that I am listing or talking about in our sources, so they are available. And most of them, all of them, but like one did not have a paywall, which was incredible and really uncommon.
Yeah, that's very nice.
That doesn't happen a lot.
I know. But yeah, there was further study on the relationship between different professions in psychopathy. And generally, it's been found that people that hold like managerial positions or those who work in occupations that are frequently exposed to occupational risks, so that would be like police officers, firefighters, that kind of thing, and the managerial positions like CEO, lawyers, all that stuff, were found to show higher levels of psychopathic traits versus jobs or people that don't have managerial positions and aren't really exposed to that inherent risk in their day-to-day job, which was kind of fascinating because even though those two studies were conducted by like completely different research groups at different times, like they kind of corroborate each other. Yeah, but these, of course, once again, are estimates based on a large research sample. It's not the entire population, but they are still relatively reliable because we trust these researchers. But how are we actually measuring whether a person is or is not a psychopath? So there are like a few methods. Like I did mention a tool earlier for it that was used by Dutton, but one of the most validated and reliable is the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or I'm going to call it the PCLR. And this assesses symptoms of psychopathy and rates their psychopathic or antisocial habits. So the PCLR is widely used in legal and clinical settings like prisons and psychiatric hospitals. And it's largely used as an intake tool, usually to assess an individual's risk for violent behavior, kind of so that they can help in like building treatment plans and also like helping court decisions to determine sentencing and where they need to go and like what security prison they need to be in. So the PCLR is a set of 20 items that are essentially the symptoms of psychopathy or the traits that are identifiable. And each item is scored between 0 and 2, with 0 meaning the item does not at all apply to you. 1 is it kind of applies, like maybe in a few scenarios. And 2 is that this person definitely has this trait. So the highest score possible is 40, and generally. Anywhere between like 25 and 30 is kind of like the accepted threshold for being considered a psychopath. Like some research uses 25, some research uses 27, like some clinical settings use 30. It's, in terms of how people are interpreting it, it's not terribly reliable, but in terms of the like the validity of it and how it applies across populations, it's relatively reliable. So I'm going to read off all 20 items of this checklist, just because I know that earlier I listed all the diagnostics symptoms of ASPD, but that I said that it was missing a few from psychopathy. So here are the 20 items that the PCLR assesses for. There's glib and superficial charm, grandiose or exaggeratedly high estimation of self, need for stimulation, pathological lying, cunning and manipulativeness, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect or superficial emotional responsiveness, callousness and lack of empathy, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavior controls, sexual promiscuity, early behavior problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions, many short-term marital relationships, juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release, and criminal versatility. So I know I kind of just ran through those, but I see your faces both suggesting that you heard a lot of them that relate to John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah.
I was giggling at ones that related to me, and there's shockingly a lot.
Oh, me too. Like specifically the one need for stimulation. I was like, hey.
That's what got me laughing at first, and then I started counting on my fingers. Anyways,
yeah. See, it feels a little alarming. Like when we all read those and we're like, oh no, I kind of relate to this. But then remember, like 25 to you need a score of 25 to 30 to be considered the most minimum psychopath.
Yeah.
You can get a score of 40 out of 40, which means like you scored, oh, absolutely, that's me on every single one of them.
Yeah. Wild. I Googled what Gacy got on that test, and he got 27 out of 40.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. It's weird that like there's a couple like sources suggest like he got anywhere from like 27 to 31, but either way that's within like psychopathic range.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Makes sense.
It makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, but I'm just going to move on from assessments for a little. I had a slight blurb about validity and reliability testing, but that was just basically saying what I said earlier about how it has been scrutinized heavily and it is found it's obviously more valid and reliable amongst a general male prison population because that is who it was originally designed for. But there is more recent research doing it on like the validity of using it on like female populations or non-prison populations. And they're finding that in general, like it's still a pretty good tool for estimating psychopathic traits. Yeah, moving on from that. While individuals with high levels of psychopathy are around 2 times more likely than someone without to commit violent crimes, having a low to medium level or even high level in some instances of psychopathy, like we were saying, does not guarantee that someone's going to end up committing crime. But of course, for this episode, that's not exactly what we're here to talk about. So for those individuals with psychopathy that do end up acting violently or aggressively, how does that affect them? Studies on the intersection of psychopathy and crime have shown that on average, psychopaths are between 20 and 25 times more likely to be imprisoned for crime than non-psychopaths. And they are about 4 to 8 times more likely to violently recidivate, which basically means when they're released from prison, recidivate means they're going to commit another crime once they're released to be put back into prison. They are 4 to 8 times more likely to violently recidivate when compared to an equal sample of non-psychopaths released from prison, which is frightening. Which
Very
also
much
goes to
so.
show that they were right that they shouldn't have released John Wayne Gacy.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
He even said, like, he's going to do this again.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
they were on the right track.
Yeah.
Don't release him.
Yeah.
Yeah, but when it comes to famous psychopaths in the sense of sensationalized serial killers who everyone assumes must be a psychopath, it gets a little bit trickier to factually discuss this, just because obviously not every serial killer's PCLR results are going to be published. A lot of the results that we see online are like people doing like in-depth kind of like analyses of, for example, Richard Ramirez. They look at everything he did and they like kind of fill it out for him on what they think. So it's a little hard for me personally to rely on what the internet's telling me about whether or not these people are genuinely psychopaths. But as you had said, Journey, from your search, John Wayne Gacy was actually administered the PCLR, and even though like I get mixed results between like 27 and 31 for what he actually scored, this does still put him on the lower, but still puts him on the scale of being a diagnosed diagnosed psychopath. I keep getting that and the word sociopath mixed up because older research calls them sociopaths.
Yeah, that's fair.
I was gonna say you're doing a very good job at psychopath because I get like psychopath, psychopathy, and psychopathic all mixed up. If that's even how you pronounce the third.
It is so funny you say that because that's actually, I was reading, just small tangent about psychopathy. While I was researching this, there's a really great website. It's by a researcher who has spent like their whole life researching psychopathy and how to treat it. I can't remember their name right now, but they run an organization called Psychopathy Is, and it's online, and it's basically just a map. It's a website full of like information and research and stuff like this about what is and is not psychopathy, and trying to break the stigmatism and teaching that there is actually treatment for it. I referenced them a lot during this episode. It was so helpful. But they were saying that one of the reasons that psychopathy was not initially put in the DSM-5 was because the term is kind of confusing to people because the word psychology is very similar to psychopathy, but they obviously mean very different things. And then you have psychopathology, psychopathology, which just is like all mental disorders. Like the psychopathology of a person is what their mental state is. So they didn't like psychopathy, one, because it's stigmatizing, but also just because it sounds like so many other words. Like it is so easy to get mixed up. And you're right. Like there's times when I was writing this and in my brain, I'm going psychopathy, psychology. And I'm like, no, none of those are right. It's not a word to me anymore. It is simply not a word. But just moving on from my little tangent about words that start with psi and end with ology. So John Wayne Gacy, as we had said, is somewhere between like 27 and 31 on the scale. But in comparison, and apparently this is like widely known, all my sources have the same thing. Ted Bundy reportedly scored one of the highest of any known psychopath, with a 39 out of 40 on the PCLR.
Wow.
So and that was kind of strange to me because I completely understand, looking at what he did, that could be the case. Mm-hmm. And he is so well put together, and like CEOs can be psychopaths, they're put together, but I don't know, like it just, I think he is like a great, like, I don't know what words I'm trying to use right now, but essentially like when we think of a true psychopath, Ted Bundy is not necessarily the first person that comes to mind just because he was so meticulous, but I think that makes the most sense is because he was so callous and seemed so put together, and like he did not care that people thought this about him. And he's kind of like, gross to say, but like the perfect representation of a psychopath. I don't want to say he's perfect in any way, but he almost is for psychopaths.
Yeah. Well, I feel like he's just like two-faced enough almost to like be the perfect psychopath, because he does present to this world as this attractive white man who is successful, but then there's also the side of him where it's truly psychopathic. But I also think he is a little bit of a sociopath too. Like, I don't think like psychopathy was his only illness.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap this episode or wrap this topic up a little bit, I just wanted to get into some really small kind of facts about psychopathy. Just saying, like, it's important to remember that even though psychopathy is like, it can be considered like a scary disorder, it is really heavily stigmatized to the point of like, we're scared to be associated with it. And because of that, there's a lot of people that might want to get help for it, but don't want to reach out because they think people are going to see them so differently. So if you know someone that is being treated for it or think they need it, like, don't be scared of them. Just in terms of like how common it possibly could be, like I said earlier, it could actually be considered a spectrum disorder in that there is people who fall low on it and have like the minimum amount of symptoms needed to be considered to the people on the very high end of the spectrum, like Ted Bundy. And it is believed that psychopathy is actually twice as common as schizophrenia, anorexia, and bipolar disorder.
Wow.
Which I thought was fascinating. I had no idea. But it just goes to show that we've, like, all three of us very likely could know someone that genuinely does have significant levels of psychopathic traits. And they're not violent, dangerous people because, like everyone else, there's just something a little different about them. So there is like a good chance we might score highly on one or two of the traits that I mentioned earlier, like we were all laughing about. But obviously it depends on the severity of the symptoms as well as the threshold that's being used to diagnose it. And then one more thing, just relating to psychopaths in movies, because I heard this fact like almost 10 years ago now, and I was like, that's fascinating. And then I actually read the study today, which I was like, that's cool. Or rather, I read multiple articles about the study because it was blocked by a paywall. There was a study conducted in 2014 by two researchers, Leistet and Linkowski, in which they basically got a team of researchers specializing in like psychopathic research, where they analyzed 400 movies released between 1915 and 2010 to identify which films most accurately portrayed psychopathic traits. Slight side note, apparently watching all 400 of these and analyzing them took them about 3 years.
Wow. Well, they probably had to also double blind test it too, or whatever it is. Get multiple people watching the same movie to get multiple answers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, true. I like to think that all of these researchers would get together for like movie night and like discuss what they're doing. But knowing this is a legitimate, like, peer-reviewed study, they probably didn't just have a fun little movie night for all of these. But yeah, through these 400 movies, they found that 126 characters that they thought could actually be identified as having like realistic enough traits that they could represent like what psychopathy looks like. And interestingly, only 21 of these 126 characters were women. I also thought that was pretty cool, just not cool, but interesting. Just given like women in the general population make up a minority of psychopaths, and it's just neat to see that is also represented in film. Probably also a result of the fact that like films represent men as main characters more anyways, but that's like a whole other feminist topic.
But even on that same topic, like the DSM-5 was written on the like diagnosing of men. Like,
absolutely.
It was mainly used and targeted for men, so a lot of the diagnoses are a little bit different for women as we're learning. So I'm hoping a DSM-6 comes out.
Yeah, me too. I always forget, even the DSM-5, you're right, was geared towards research of men, just like psychopathy was geared towards that. But I'm glad we're finally in an age that we're starting to finally learn about women's brains too. But yeah, so only 21 of them were women, which, similar to the population, makes up the minority. And then further, which I always remembered, was that of all of the characters they determined accurately represented psychopathic traits, the most accurate was the main character, who's played by Javier Bardem in the movie No Country for Old Men. So if you want to see what a real, like, pretty close to real high level psychopath looks like, I'd highly recommend you go and give the movie No Country for Old Men a watch. I am just going to give a little precursor to that I didn't get through the movie simply because it was really boring to me.
Oh, okay.
Which really, really surprised me, because I specifically remember watching it because I heard this fact. And I was like, oh, I want to see that. Like, I'm fascinated in psychology. And yeah, it's like a 3-hour movie, and I wasn't completely sure what was happening. And I do agree that man, like, I wouldn't want to fuck with that man. Sorry for the language. But yeah, be prepared for a 3-hour movie if you want to see what a psychopath looks like.
Fair enough. And unfortunately, oh, sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
It's good. I was going to say, I went to Google No Country for Old Men, whatever, and as soon as I wrote No Country, it filled in for old men psychopath. Yeah, I think it's what it's known for.
Yep. Yeah,
he was a really good actor, because he does look like he's such a good actor, but he scares the living daylights out of me.
Right?
I think it's the haircut for me that's doing it.
The bowl cut, I think that would do it for anyone.
Like berries and cream with the dark eyes, though, just staring into your soul.
Yeah. There's one scene in particular. I don't remember who pointed it out. Like, I think we might have watched it in a psychology class. I can't remember. I'll send it to you guys, and then, I don't know, maybe I'll put it in like our sources like list. I'll say like, this chunk of movie is what I'm talking about. But there's one scene in particular that I remember someone saying, like, this is the one that you can tell he's a psychopath. And it's just him, like, staring down a gas station attendant asking, like, let's flip a coin. And the guy's like, well, what do I win if I get tails? And he said, you win your life back. And he's basically like holding I don't want to spoil it, and I'm also butchering it because I'm the absolute worst at retelling stories. But I'll send you guys the link, and I will put the link in our sources so that I don't butcher it and ruin it for whoever thinks it might actually be interesting.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but that's all I had on psychopathy. I didn't know where to start, and I didn't know where to end with this topic because there's so much research on so many different aspects of it. But I hope that kind of gave like a beginner's intro to the vast topic of psychopathy.
No, I think it really did.
Yeah, I think it was really well done. Like, and it's interesting too to like see the different perspectives too of how psychopathy is portrayed. Like, how are you talking about like in media and like the disparity between women and men that show symptoms, that kind of thing. I feel like I learned a lot today. I will say that.
Me too. I think I learned more from you, Journey, than I would have learned through the John Wayne Gacy tapes, because I'm not very good at listening to TV, and I was almost too scared to watch that. And you leave out so much childhood as well.
Yeah, they leave out so much information.
And I feel like that's so like crucial to contextualizing everything that happened, though. Like, it is not to say that it excuses what he did in any way whatsoever, but like you just get to see a bigger picture of the shit that happened and why it's so horrific. Like, you can understand.
Exactly.
I completely agree. I think, really slight tangent, like I think that goes similar. By the way, I think we should do an episode on Eileen Wuornos, but I think it's the same thing. Like, people that don't know how terrible Eileen Wuornos' childhood was see her as a lot more brutal and evil than what I genuinely think she actually was. And it's just fascinating how many like serial killers we would look at a little bit differently if we actually bothered to go into their childhoods.
Yeah, well, I was telling my grandma that I was researching John Wayne Gacy and telling her, like, he's just such a terrible man. And she's like, what was his childhood like? Like, he must have had, like, a horrific childhood. And I was like, yes, you are 100% right. Like, it was terrible.
Yeah. That is crazy. Okay, well, thank you both for educating me on so many things and leaving me viscerally disgusted yet intrigued. So thank you. I hope our audience members are feeling similar things, I guess. I don't know. You can feel whatever you want to feel. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
That's what I meant to say. Our next episode is we're going to cover the dating game killer and kind of discuss forensic sketch artists, the art behind that, what that entails. I know this has been a little bit long of an episode, so my did you know I'll do really quick and I'll leave you hanging. Did you know that in 1981 there was an archaeology dig that uncovered this coffin? It was a lead-lined coffin of a medieval man, and he was preserved so well to the fact that he looked like he had died weeks ago. And this individual died somewhere in between the 1250s to 1500s.
Wow.
Oh my God, was he a vampire?
No.
Is he like a confirmed vampire? Oh.
No. But I'll leave that with
That's
you.
insane.
If you have any questions, sorry, you'll have to look it up, and I will post a Forensic Friday about it.
Boo, I want to know why they chose lead.
His name is the St. Bees Man. I will say that. It was just, it's so cool. It's the location.
To do with bees? Oh, okay.
No, it's just the location.
I'm so excited for our Forensic Friday. I'm not even going to look it up. I'm just going to wait for the post.
Okay. Yeah, they found that his last meal was oats and raisins. And during the autopsy, they found liquid blood in his lung, in his chest cavity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
How is he not a vampire if he died in the 1250s and he's like perfectly preserved?
I don't know. I want to believe everything that I've seen on this like seems very genuine, and I'm going to believe that is genuine. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, what if this is like an archaeology hoax?
Yeah.
But I don't think so. I don't think so.
I will join you in that delusion.
Yeah. But this is the St. Bees Man. But anyways, thank you to our listeners for sticking in this far and learning all of these things with us. If you want to find out more, we've kind of alluded to it already, but you can find us on our website at whattheforensics.ca. This is your one-stop shop for everything forensics with us and, you know, our sources, source images. We do recommendations. You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at whattheforensics. Our Twitter, our Twix, our X, whatever it's called nowadays. You can find us there at WT Forensics PC, and give us a shout at whattheforensics@gmail.com if you love to use email. Some people love email, and we're here for it. Make sure to give us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We do love to read them. It does mean a lot to us, and it kind of helps us out in the world of podcasting. And this has been another episode of What the Forensics. We hope you learned a lot. We hope you enjoyed it to the best that you could, given the circumstances. I know I did. And we will see you next time. Bye!
Just a reminder to everyone that we are not professionals in the forensic science field. We are just interested in forensics and want to share what we are learning with our listeners. We're trying to give you the most accurate information, but we are human and can make mistakes. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope to see you next week.